my name is Ian Fish. I'm a committee member of BCS ISSG. For those of you who are members of ISSG who remember long memories, I used to be the chair of it some time ago. And before that, I was the membership secretary for many, many years. So welcome. And I'm having to do everything today, so I'm going to have to let people in as well as talk to you. But let's do a sort of introduction thing. So what have we got today? Well, Chris is going to be doing a presentation at 18:35. When he's finished, I don't know whether it'll be 19:20 or he'll take less or more time than that.
I
Probably
think it
less.
depends how many questions.
Yeah, well, then we do Q&A.
Well, it could be interjections.
Yeah, we can have, however he wants to play it, he can do interjections or whatever. And then we'll go and have some wine or whatever you want and something a little bit to eat out in the atrium. So I don't know how many of you are actually BCS members? All of you? No, just there's a few who are not. So as it says here, what is the BCS? It's the Chartered Institute for IT. 70,000 members again. We've got up to that again, which is good because we were down below 60 at one point. Lots of local branches and international sections as well, and 50 plus specialist groups. The ISSG, it's the largest specialist group. It's only beaten in size by a couple of the branches, the Central London branch. So the information specialist group got around 3,500 members. And the important thing about the ISSG is it's not for information specialists, it's an information security specialists, because as we were saying earlier, I think some of us in here earlier, everybody in IT, really the membership of the ISSG should be the same as the membership of BCS, in my view. It's a shame that it isn't, so, because security is everybody's business. So we've got some events coming up soon. You should have been notified of them, those of you who are in the ISSG. And there's a BT Security Showcase event at Industrial Park in Suffolk, Martlesham. That is a in-person event only, and it's very limited in size. So if you haven't already registered, I don't know if it's too late already, but get yourself on the waiting list in case somebody drops out. And we've also got a joint event with the FinSec Financial Specialist Group on the 9th of May, Software Resilience. The Legal Day series will be starting up again soon, but we haven't got actual dates, but you'll be notified. So there'll be probably 4 or 5 events during the year. And that used to be a day, but we now do it in 4 or 5 individual events. And there'll be some more events on standards up. And for those of you who are interested, and there's some very good events at Navy University, and we'll have one with them to their events as well. It's very good, so it's worth looking at that. Housekeeping, there's no Chatham House rule, so not in that space this time. I will be monitoring the chat, so please, I'll obviously take questions from the audience, or Chris will, but I will also interject questions at the end from the attendees online. So I'll be doing that as well. And if there's anything outstanding from those online, I will we'll be looking at the questions and emailing them after the event. And the session is being recorded. So if anybody objects to that, please leave now. Right, so now it's over to Chris. So I might say a few words about him. Chris is, says he's got 20 plus years experience. Doesn't look old enough to me, but there you go.
Near enough.
Near enough.
Did it say that?
Yeah. Covering cloud security operations, enterprise security, risk management. And he's the founder probably of Strata. Yeah. Which is a specialist consultant in security automation. And he spent years building in and securing clouds, and is passionate how cloud can transform how organizations acquire, build, and manage their technology securely. And he's going to talk today about data-driven approach, which is extreme interest. So I'll just switch this across if I can.
Maybe my slides will actually work.
Hang on. Why can't I see? Hold on. Why can't I get out of it? You said just press escape and I get out.
Well, it looks like.
Ah, that's interesting. I do.
What concerns me is that
Yeah, it's gone.
doesn't show.
Let me just go and get the man again. Sorry.
You have two screens?
Hmm?
You have two screens?
Yeah, it's just.
Yes, it's gone.
Be the main
I did
screen.
escape and nothing happened.
Is it actually casting the right screen? Okay. Right. That's the one I want.
Oh, there it is. Found it. I shall sit over here.
Excellent.
The remote moderation.
Well, thank you, Ian. And just to reiterate, I don't mind being stopped for questions. It'll help me fill in the time, actually, because I'm not quite sure if this is going to fit the exact time that.
No, those timings were given to me. They're not real. You can do
They're not real.
what you like.
Right, okay. So what time, what is this about?
Whatever suits you.
Excellent. Right, okay. Right. Fair enough. So as I mentioned, as Ian mentioned, I spent quite a lot of time working in cybersecurity in various forms. I started off working for a managed security service provider, like racking up security monitoring tools and connecting them and integrating them with customers' environments. I then did quite a lot more of that, flying all over the place, and then worked for the Big Four for about 18 months, and then set up my own consultancy, and now ultimately Strata, which we talk about slightly at the end. So the topic that I put forward for today was, how can we keep up? Because quite frankly, there's more stuff to keep secure in more places than ever before. So I'm going to try and talk a little bit about that. I guess as a little bit of a caveat, I would say this might cover more sort of infrastructure type security rather than SaaS, etc. But to be honest, I started trying to put all that stuff in, and then it got over an hour. So happy to talk about a glass of something later on. Right. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about industry challenges and expectations. I'm going to reminisce slightly about how things were before. I'm going to talk about the landscape today and just like that gets. What are we looking for? What do we want to achieve as security professionals? And then I'm going to work through a bit of an example of just how challenging sometimes this stuff can be. And then I'm going to talk about SaaS, AI, everything else, and try and bring it to a little bit of a close. So if I'm overrunning, somebody feel free to raise their arm or shout at me or whatever. So no problem. Right. So what are the challenges today? Well, there's lots, but three main ones I wanted to talk about. IT, cloud, security are more complex, and there's more stuff, and it's changing faster than perhaps ever before. We've got increased, and this is a good thing, increased interest from the board, from senior management, and obviously society in cybersecurity and the impact that it can have in the real world. But also new ways of working. And a previous iteration I had of this slide from some time ago had a lovely virus-related picture, but I think that we've kind of moved beyond that now, luckily. So really it's about, the more hybrid working that most people are following today, but of course not everybody. And I mentioned obviously about this board level interest in cybersecurity. There are increased expectations, I think, of what we should do about security. And from a practitioner's perspective, the downside of that is that we not only have to do security well, but we have to, so for example, if we're working, we need to know, is this a vulnerability? Is this an issue? Is this a risk? Do IT need to fix something? We've got to manage it well as well. So we've got to make sure that all those processes and operations are working properly. So management want to know we missed something. We've got to communicate what we're doing. So we've got to keep the board happy that the right amount of money has been spent on cybersecurity, that the right outcomes are being achieved, meeting our objectives. But finally, audit pops up with a question. Not only do you need to do all those things, but then eventually you've got to prove it. So with the cloud in the mix as well, things are far more complicated than perhaps they ever used to be. And this is my reminiscence slide a little bit, right? So this is how things used to be. You had a network architecture. This picture is, I think, from Cisco's website. And your trusted stuff was in here. and your not trusted stuff was up here. Fantastic. We can keep all this stuff here in one place. We can track it. We can see what's in there. We can see what's connected, what's not connected. And we know that if some data is in here, we probably need to protect it very carefully. However, today things are a little bit more complex. As I mentioned, there's more things in more places, perhaps, and the cloud security landscape, well, specifically the security landscape is incredibly complex. There's lots of tools, products, and offerings out there. But ultimately, that means that we've got trusted stuff pretty much everywhere. It's in a data center. It's in somebody else's data center, as in AWS, GCP, whatever else, your providers. And of course, it's at home. You've got people with their endpoint home and they're carrying on with their lives from their Wi-Fi or whatever else. So it's a very complex situation, and quite frankly, it just adds to the level of the to-do list for the team that's trying to keep all this stuff safe. This clicker actually works, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Excellent. Nice. That's a good idea.
You can go over there.
Yeah, I can stand in perhaps a slightly more convenient location. I'm not quite sure between the two, or what's the?
Could be.
No. It feels awkward to stand in front of this, so in front of the chairs.
Sit down then.
No, I'm going to sit down. I'll just stick here for now. Right. Okay. So, just a second here. So, what's the effect of this? So, as the professional trying to keep all of this stuff secure in more places and with things moving faster, what's the effect? The effect is that what you're trying to keep track of what assets have we got? Is everything patched? Has everything got antivirus? Are we closing our alerts? Is everything configured properly? And you've got to do that across multiple clouds. And it's very unusual that an organization just has one cloud these days. Because even if you have, let's say you're putting everything into Azure or something like that, you've usually got more than one account within Azure or tenant to keep, for example, production, development, UAT, your different business units in different regions, they're all in their own accounts. So even if you're just a one cloud kind of environment, you've got that challenge. You've got multiple security tools, and unfortunately, they don't talk to each other. So yet again, back and forth, trying to get that sort of single visibility. And of course, in most environments today, that's in combination with your on-premise equipment, of course, the stuff that's deployed in wherever your sites are, but also third parties potentially. So maybe you've got one of the big IT primes that's helping with your day-to-day operations or providing your IT management, etc. So very complicated and frustrating. So the result of this is that as a practitioner, you're working really inefficiently, trying to keep track of all of that. You're probably going to miss something. It's unfortunately very manual. And quite frankly, it's frustrating. You want to keep everything secure and protected as a security professional, but you end up doing something that's a little bit like this. I call it security excellence with emphasis on the Excel. We've got a console for one product, got a console for another product, or the ordering isn't quite right on this, sorry. And then maybe a spreadsheet to keep track of. I don't know if anybody relates to this in terms of trying to keep track of assets across various things, but quite frankly, it's incredibly frustrating. So where do we go from here? Problem is that once you've got started to get a handle on that, maybe you've built some fantastic spreadsheets, you've started to use all the data that's available within your cloud environments. This person comes along. Now, this guy is the first, or was previously, the first Google image search for the word auditor. But he's no longer, unfortunately. I checked last week. So lots of stereotypes there. I won't go any further. But ultimately, he's evidence what you're doing about patching. Oh, okay, right, great. Go get some data. Here's some spreadsheets. We're good on patching. Hopefully good on patching. What about last year? So that kind of thing, right? So there's lots of data out there, but it's incredibly hard to keep on top of all of this, right? So let's just move on and talk a little bit about, okay, that's the challenge. What's the current situation? What do we actually want? Well, as a professional, we want to secure a faster moving business, basically. We want to work fast, we want to move faster so we can enable the business to move faster. We want to make sure everything's protected, and we want to give IT and perhaps the wider sort of operations teams, for example, the data and the information they need to do their job better or to respond. Oversight for management, and maybe even some really nice charts that we can give to senior management to show them that they're doing the right things. And the vision here is that because all this data that we've got is out there, we can do something like this, which is where security, IT, perhaps risk and compliance, the guy on the previous slide, the senior management are all working from a very similar data set back and forth with some spreadsheets. So that's the vision. What I'd like to do a little bit is explore some of the reality. Any questions coming in?
No, not yet.
Don't mind being interrupted for questions partway through, by the way.
Yeah. You just raise your hand and he'll come to you. Nothing online yet. I'll ask again.
So. Work through a bit of an example and just talk about what is out there and the reality of what we've just been speaking about. Let's take a relatively simple example with quotes. You want to keep your relatively normal IT and endpoint environment secure. And the great thing is that with today's infrastructures and with the amount of data there is in the cloud about your environments, you can do a lot to find out your status. So, for example, most endpoints and IT and cloud infrastructures have, for example, agents and things deployed on them, which might be keeping them patched, keeping them secure, keeping them up to date with their malware protection, etc. And that level of sort of observability or telemetry or data just wasn't there before because those tools were much more spread out. There weren't lovely APIs to pull the information from them. So just to give a flavor of just how comprehensive that can be, even in just a very small environment today. I didn't quite expect. Okay, fine. We've got so many data sources, right? So, for example, encryption status. We want to know that it's compliant. We want to know that it's being protected. Data at rest has been protected across endpoints, across let's say cloud-based cloud-hosted servers. We've got things like Microsoft Intune. We've got all kinds of products out there that are sort of giving us data about the status of the devices. Similar with malware and things like that. Obviously we've got maybe particular products like the Microsoft environment, but also we've got alternatives. So there's lots of different data points out there about how we're doing on the protection status of our devices, what's been detected, all that kind of stuff. There's also good data on patching. So that's, I mentioned before, Intune, that's a good one for sort of patch data, etc. But there's all kinds of data out there spread out across your different providers and tech stacks. So what can we do? Well, there's got to be a catch here, right? It sounds like we can just do everything we need with the cloud, right? It's fine. So the problem is that all of these tools, and some of them are on the previous slide, they weren't really built with this in mind. And unfortunately, there aren't really any standards for this kind of data and how it should be presented yet, but that probably will change over time. And the other thing is that tracking assets is complicated because actually, unfortunately, even sort of relatively vanilla environments, assets life cycles are actually also quite complicated. So just think, I mean, it's slightly boring to talk about endpoints in the world of AI, but tracking, okay. What happened there? Obviously the screen got bored. So think about your average endpoint in let's say a mid-sized company. The owner of that laptop or whatever might go on parental leave. They might go on sick leave. They might lose it in the pub. It might get stolen. It might be found again, and then it might get broken. It might get fixed, and maybe it might get found and then recycled. And of course, all of those things affect how it would, for example, be seen within one of those tools. So while there's so much data there, it is complicated. And as I'll walk through in a minute, once you start to look at this, you're going to surface problems that both IT and yourself weren't aware of. So I've got a little animation on this just to kind of I spend a lot of time doing this kind of stuff. I apologize. So, oh, question?
So we have a question from the online people.
Yeah.
You may be going this way anyway.
Okay, yeah.
But it might be somebody anticipating. It was to do with your vision that
Yeah.
you came up with first. And is your vision not realized by cloud security posture management tools, which automate that data collection and presentation?
Yes.
That's
To an
why you're
extent.
heading.
To an extent, right. That's that subcategory of products, well, that category of products, I should say, is delivering on this vision, I would say, for, let's say, your infrastructures in the cloud. When it comes to a hybrid infrastructure where some of it's in the cloud, some of it's remote, some of it's on premise, then that's where those tools perhaps don't sort of cover all of that. But yes, they share the same vision, is probably the way I would say it. Hopefully that's answered the question. So, yes, and this could well fall into the cloud posture management as well. So I should probably make sure I get that covered next time I talk about this. So let's take your relatively simple example. Sorry, this every time I click, this goes back and forth. Okay, it's only 20 devices, but all of these 20 devices are in your directory. It might be something like Microsoft your directory. Wonderful. We've got a list of all the things that are out there, and maybe before in the old way of working, this wasn't quite so easy. But let's start to work through this. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to see which of those devices are also present in our endpoint protection service. Great. The ones in green are in the endpoint protection service. They've, for example, it's been checked that they are configuration compliant, they're running encryption. That's great. However, you'll notice that there are some outliers. So, okay, we need to think about what we're going to do with those, but I'll cover the outliers at the end. And the next thing that normally happens is you then plug in some other kind of data. Let's say maybe your antivirus platform, Sophos or whatever it is. And then you get something like that. And you'll see here, we've obviously got some core assets here, which are obviously nice, well managed, but then there's some other outliers. What does this mean? Well, as I mentioned before, the life cycle of assets, and this obviously is an endpoint example, it's similar for servers and for AWS, sort of cloud infrastructure, maybe sort of ephemeral infrastructure as well. When it comes to endpoints, you have examples like this asset existed before we started controlling things, so predates the controls. It's just uncontrolled. Somebody had it and just somehow got it connected. It's been recycled. It's on a shelf somewhere waiting out to go to a new person. It's been lost. It's been lost and found again. It's inactive because the person's on paternity leave, or we just don't know. So what's interesting here is that what we've kind of done here is by pulling all of this data from this data we didn't have before, perhaps, we now suddenly have more problems to solve. And unfortunately, a lot of security is unsexy asset management. So a lot of this sort of comes up. So going back to what we were trying to achieve earlier, but other points. So we want to obviously secure a faster moving environment. We want to make sure that everything is protected, and we want to give wider IT the data and tools to respond to maybe an incident or something similar, and oversight and metrics. So what have we actually achieved? Example. Well, we've got a very agile way of seeing what's out there and measuring what we've seen versus what we think we had. We've got assurance, well, apart from the outliers, that things are protected. We're going to give wider IT the details of what they need to fix, which is obviously a good thing. Perhaps that was more difficult before. And from the data that we've retrieved, we can also actually give some pretty good metrics on what's protected, which is obviously very useful for keeping management and senior leaders on board. So yes, the data is out there to do security in a more agile way using the data that we have. So to summarize, the opportunity, I guess, to start with, we've got a huge amount of data that we can exploit now, and it's much easier to access that data perhaps than ever before. Within individual environments, the data itself is reliable and usually up to date and well structured. So you can use it programmatically. That's great. We can apply a data-driven process to this. And also, for example, the access controls and being able to get access to that data in a secure way are pretty good as well, because obviously these are public APIs on the internet, and the providers need to make sure that it's all you can get access to it in a way where you don't need too many privileges. However, the challenge, as we sort of hinted at before, is that it might be that previously IT may not have had processes in place to govern these things in quite the same way. So I talked extensively about an endpoints type scenario. Sorry, the same thing also applies to SaaS, AI technologies, large language models, all that kind of thing. It's important that there is a process in place to govern these so that you can be sure that whatever it is, it's secure throughout its entire life cycle. And some other things where I just about to sort of, I guess, from doing quite a lot of this with working with customers, there's limited standards for interchange of asset data. So there's lots of problems to overcome. For example, names not being consistent, things not having a unique ID, which is always fun, and things like that. And also how when an asset's details are changed, how that's modeled over time. But that's boring, geeky stuff that I probably spend too much time working on. And then finally, I would say when something isn't sort of cloud native, when it comes to the on-prem environment, of course, it's very different. And there's a lot of a challenge there of aligning that. And you start providing stats about things which are cloud managed, but then there's an obvious gap of perhaps the less sort of more traditionally managed stuff and how you sort of communicate those differences to the business. So in summary, we can do a lot, but there are some challenges. So that obviously, just to sort of move away from sort of the endpoint scenario, obviously many organizations come along, many organizations come across. More generally, within infrastructure as a service, so sort of say AWS, GCP, Azure, obviously, there is a lot of security good news that we should celebrate. Right? So if you're trying to keep those environments secure, pretty much all of them have a good suite of, well, I would say, relatively low-cost tools to keep you in a good place. So, for example, within AWS, you've got AWS Config, Compliance, and Systems Manager that are there to make sure that all of the things that are created in the cloud, whether by people or by build processes, that those are compliant and kept secure throughout their life cycle and have all the right stuff on them, for example. And there's equivalents within Azure and GCP, obviously, platform. Finally, we've got, well, say fine. It's also important to note that encryption in both data at rest and in transit is now pretty much universally there by default. It used to be in certain cloud environments that things weren't encrypted by default by rest, which was interesting, but those things have all been moved along. So we've got good data at rest encryption controls, good. Authentication and sign-on, also, again, that's really good. It's enables you to have federated authentication. You don't need usernames and passwords kicking around. And obviously there are good, for example, authentication and authorization controls. So you can, for example, give read-only access to people instead of global admin in order to be able to sort of do auditor type tasks, for example. And security monitoring is good, right? Every cloud environment has a really good audit trail of who did what. And that's just not possible to replicate in a more traditional on-premise infrastructure at all. Those are always big challenges. So there's lots of good news. However, the one thing that's still my big concern, challenge, whatever, is outbound. When you build for example, IaaS cloud environment, obviously there are usually you're usually encouraged to have good controls about the inbound data network access, so who can access what ports, having firewalls or the equivalents within that environment. However, the environments usually assume that outbound connectivity is open and that the infrastructure can access the entire internet. That means that and for some reason, I don't really know why this is. I mean, it's interesting if anyone else has any opinion on this. That not enough bad things have happened yet. I don't know if anyone remembers a couple of years ago, we had the log4j incident, where lots of services were compromised, and then, for example, credentials were leaked out via the internet. One of the critical things there was that many of those compromised devices had pretty much unlimited outbound internet access. So, for example, you could leak the credentials by basically coercing Java into leaking access keys via, for example, something like DNS or internet request. So, good controls, but beware of outbound. That's my summary. Anyone else have any fun with log4j? Yeah, well, fun for want of a better word. Yeah. Any more questions from the? No. Okay. Right. Fair enough. Right, how am I doing for time?
They're almost as quiet as they are.
I know. I need to work on what.
Here we go.
Go for it.
You mentioned security and encryption, address and encryption movement.
Yep.
SQL Server, transparent encryption.
Mhm.
As long as you get hold of data, it's not impossible to break it. There are many hacks available on internet.
Yeah. Sorry. All of this stuff is compatible with enough intent and result, right? What I was saying there is a well-known cloud provider up until, let's say, 4 or 5 years ago, when you created a new resource, whether it be a SQL server or standard Linux or Windows server in that environment, it didn't have data at rest encryption on the disks by default.
Right.
So you relied on their goodwill internally to make sure that when they lost their drives or decommissioned them, that there wasn't your data on them. That's obviously changed, and the default is a good thing now. But there's still infrastructures out there. As of a couple of months ago, I saw one where it's like, oh, do you realize all that stuff in this region doesn't have these controls? Just because it predated when the default was good, right?
Hi, you were talking about challenges of asset management.
Yes.
Maybe you're going to come onto it, in a little bit, but I just wonder whether you had any thoughts around ephemeral assets in cloud.
Well, actually, I don't have a slide on that. That's actually something that's an interesting point, and it actually keeps coming up. It does depend on what the thing is that's ephemeral. And I often have this discussion with people about how, there's always a kind of how do we want to control this? Do we want to control this particular type of ephemeral device as in the same way as we would control, let's say, a server? Or is it something where the configuration of that device is so inbuilt into a build process that it shouldn't necessarily be treated as the same, because it's not something that necessarily needs to have all the agents running on it that a server would, for example. So the short answer to your question is it's something that I don't have a particular, it should be this or it should be that answer on it. Very much depends. With some ephemeral devices, and depending, let's say, for example, it was a non-production environment that was used to spin up temporary BI tools or something. As a security governance person, you would probably want to know that they had existed and have confidence that they've been built in a way that you're happy. So, for example, if the log said these servers or these ephemeral, let's say, containers have been sprung up, and they were of the type BI tool, and you had a process that you were happy that those were kind of suitably secured, then that probably would be enough. But there are probably other cases, let's say, for example, where it's maybe database servers or something like that, that would be built as part of a specific project and maybe got rid of after a certain period of time. Then they would probably need many of the same controls because, of course, they're, for example, they've got ports open whereby if somebody compromised them, there would be lots of data lost or something. So yeah, there's no kind of hard and fast about this, but it's very much down to what those devices are doing. Call them a device. I'm going to call them an asset.
It's assets.
They're an asset that existed for a period of time.
So I mean, that example might be, say, virtual machines are being spun up as part of, say, an auto scaling function
Mhm.
where you need them to be around for a period to
Yes.
deal with some peak workload, and then you destroy them or reduce the number that you have. And you might be in an organization where you've got some kind of aspiration or target to be patching to a certain level or to be doing vulnerability scanning so that you know, have we got any vulnerabilities out there? And there seems to be a slight contradiction, a slight challenge there in terms of the old ways of doing things, where perhaps you would measure things to say, you know, what percentage are we patched? What percentage are we, you know, this level of vulnerability, when you've got things that are coming up and down all over the show? Because you could argue,
Oh, yeah.
you know, if you're automatically building those things, why
Well-
do you actually care?
Well,
And
we-
I'm deliberately playing devil's advocate.
Oh, of course,
there,
yeah.
because if you're using infrastructure as code to build the things and you're not going to patch them, you're going to just redeploy them.
Well, the deployment process may.
It's a different model.
So in that auto scaling scenario you
Yeah.
mentioned, let's say it's containers, just for easiness, and there's effectively like a pod of containers, and it sort of spins up more of them when it's busy and gets rid of them afterwards. You can obviously see how many of those are of which type, and effectively, I'm really bad with the terminology, but what process or recipe has been followed to build those extra devices. I would say you need to make sure that the 8 that have appeared are the same as the one that stays there when right. And usually when it comes to those sorts of environments, patching of the infrastructure, and by that I mean up to the operating system, possibly also any databases and things like that included, usually comes as part of that. Either when it's spun up, those things are updated from a repository, or the image is continuously updated with the you know, the latest versions or whatever. There are ways of modeling and seeing how that's working, but they're so specific to the particular type of container and the application that I don't think there's a fast on it yet. So, but it's just being aware that something has spun up, so you can make sure that you're happy that it's controlled and secured. So.
That's echoed by by Mike Small, who says ephemeral resources cannot be governed by scanning. They need policy-based controls that control the creation, which is what you've said effectively, isn't it, I guess?
Yes, I
The
probably
other
need
one-
those words, shouldn't I?
Yeah, or maybe you need to do both and you treat it as a bit of belt and braces, you know.
Well, there's no reason why not. I mean, what I was going to say was that in some cases there wouldn't be time to scan them.
No. Well,
And
they've gone by the time you scan it. Yeah.
I mean, if you're, you know, ticketing, you know, you sell tickets online, you don't want the delay of waiting for it to be scanned before it becomes online. You're dealing with
Oh,
the
no.
urgency of the fact that you need to sell more tickets, so you need more resources, right? So,
You wouldn't do that.
There are some other questions here which
Go on.
relate to various bits of your thing.
it's great because I've got another 4 slides.
Okay, that's
So that-
good. So Mohammed Kunil Shafi has asked, what would be the opportunities and challenges, because you were talking about that earlier,
Yeah.
with the implementation of AI?
Oh, that is covered on.
Ah, okay, that's fine.
There you go. Well, it's not really covered, but we can
You can
make
make it
sure
covered, yeah.
that I've covered that in the next slide,
Yeah.
and then we can.
And then somebody, who's this one? Hang on, Graham G asks, any experience on another negative around the end of 2022? MFA, AITM credential phishing, has the situation improved?
Well, which particular credential?
MFA, AITM, EEC? I don't
It's
know.
email compromise.
That's,
Wait, that was the business email.
oh, that's that one.
The AITM is the one that's throwing me there. The AITM.
Don't know.
There was a big incident, right, with the credential compromise
Mhm.
from the cloud.
Hmm.
There is someone with Microsoft, right?
And then there was also obviously
Sure.
there was continuously also a lot of people were using SMS as their second factor, which is also flawed for various reasons. Has anyone worked on signaling system 7? That's the excellent. Telecoms. Yes. The system that delivers SMSs is not designed for to avoid spoofing, which is fine because it's the inherent problem with the phone system. But specifically on MFA or second factor, whatever you want to call it. The main thing is that's there by default within pretty much every environment these days, right? You can, within your clouds, all of them support their internal MFA. You know, they'll allow you to use a hardware key, authenticator on your phone, a physical device. I've still got some of them. Old school, really.
Yeah.
And also you can avoid having additional accounts very easily, because once you've got your central identity provider, let's say your Office 365 or your Azure AD or Entra, whatever it's called these days, this week, then you can then single sign on that into any number of different environments. So you don't need additional authentication tokens kicking around, and you can use your sort of your one identity provider and the authentication around that.
And Mike Small has also made an observation that cloud provider encryption is not sufficient. You need to control your encryption keys yourself.
Yes,
Which I think
true.
is-
But I'm also thinking of the fact that
Well, you have to choose.
well,
Depends on your threat model.
How paranoid you are.
well,
People are-
look, I'm just pleased that it's the default,
Exactly.
right? And you're already trusting, let's say Microsoft or AWS or probably GCP or whatever else, Alibaba, if you're got a very different risk model, then you know you're already trusting them with a lot of data. Let's say you've got all your production systems on there. You're already making a lot of decisions to effectively outsource processes around, for example, management of where at the end of its life cycle, right the way through to making sure that their actual platform is as secure as it seems to be. So testing, etc., and certification. So yeah, you do have to choose. But the good thing from my point of view is that by default, there's a good selection of things there. If you're a very high risk, then of course, yes, you do need to consider additional controls on top. And there's a lot of companies out there trying to sell products to help with that as well. So I think you were going to say, you both were going to say something.
Your previous slide, we were outbound. I mean, you just mentioned about databases, so you usually won't give outbound access to your database generally. Totally closed
Oh,
down.
no, you wouldn't, no. But if you're building a database infrastructure in a, let's say in an IaaS, so infrastructure as a service environment, either it's effectively you're building a server that has a database running on it, or you're using a SaaS database service, something, you know, like the Azure cloud, SQL Server or Postgres or whatever else. I can't remember exactly what context spinning up a database came up, to be honest. But yes, you wouldn't have it open to the internet by default, but you do need to make sure that that port isn't opened up to the internet. I can't remember exactly what we were talking about earlier with the.
So we'll let you get on now. There are a lot of questions coming in now,
Okay.
but I'll keep.
Yeah, there's not very much. I love questions, and I think
Yeah,
I've probably
I'll
got
keep-
another
I'll keep them
few
to
more
the
minutes. Right. So yeah, lots of good news with regards to IaaS, and just beware of outbound. That's the main thing. What about SaaS, AI, etc.? This is one slide to cover far too much stuff, because this is where I realized that if I kept adding more slides, this would definitely go over an hour and everybody would be late in the day, isn't it?
It's till 1:30 because we're taking questions as we go.
Yeah, no, that's cool. Right, okay, so what about SaaS, AI, etc.? So the good thing is that most enterprise grade, as in things used by, you know, or trusted by large companies, have invested really heavily in security because they know that they won't get big deals unless they have at least the very basics in place. So when it comes to things like Salesforce, Workday, HubSpot, all of those SaaS services that are embedded within many companies today, they've all got really good single sign-on, pretty good APIs for identity and access, audit logs, things like that, in general. But of course, this is not an endorsement. So there's security good news there in the fact that you can still govern those environments and how they're used, even though they're completely out of your control. The infrastructure is completely out of your control. When it comes to generative AI, and I must admit, I don't feel like I'm really doing this topic anywhere near enough justice. So let's just say that I looked at it when I was filling this slide. I kind of had a quick look at the controls that are available for a few popular products, and generally speaking, there's a few that are embedded in your Office suite. there's at least two, right? So it doesn't really matter, like basically AWS and Google. Generally, they've got pretty good controls about, setting up all the options, seeing who's got access to it, seeing and they've got good documentation about what they do with your data and your requests and your prompt. However, when it comes to external services, perhaps that's less good. So as I'll cover in the next slide, really we need to make sure we've got a strategy in there, because unfortunately, unlike the stuff I was talking about before, that's very much an emerging area. And I can't say with confidence that there are good APIs about single sign-on and security within those environments. And obviously, it's very much a big hot topic at the moment as to how we do that securely. Go ahead.
Logs.
Logs.
We do have a lot of logs.
We do. We have more logs than
The
ever.
problem is we can't see them, or we cannot browse them, or cannot view them, unless there are few applications which through a very intelligent exceptions,
Yep.
they can be picked up. But if, for example, one person who have access and he is messing with something,
Mhm.
it will go unnoticed unless it is reported by other means.
Well, yeah, application logging up until, let's say, the last few years was generally awful. So, for example, sort of administrative level auditing, as in somebody logged in, somebody failed to log in, yes, that's pretty good, generally speaking. But when it comes to like the deeper level of application logging, it's down to developers to figure out what's important when they're developing a logging module, right? And from bitter experience, I've been through quite a lot of processes of trying to sort of standardize that and bring the data in so that logging and monitoring solutions can be sort of full stack rather than just looking at stuff happening on the network. They're also looking at the business transactions that are taking place. And yes, it's a challenge. Some stuff just isn't logged that you'd expect to log. So, for example, the problem there is that decisions about what to log and therefore things that can be flagged, there's a security disjoint. The right security people aren't always involved in that conversation for applications developed within a single organization for use within the organization. However, when it comes to, let's say, the SaaS products listed on the slide, they do have good logs about who did what. I mean, for example, things like Workday, for example, and Salesforce, they've got to have a good audit trail of who changed, let's say, somebody's salary.
And they have, but how do you pick up a change without being somebody else finding it out and putting it on YouTube or somewhere else, or Twitter?
What do you mean? How do you get the log out?
I mean, you got millions of rows coming in.
Oh, yeah, of course.
How do
Yeah.
you scan them?
Oh, right, okay, right. So logging and monitoring, I can also talk about for probably hours. Obviously there's loads of commercial products out there. Within the major cloud environments, they've usually got their own inbuilt logging and monitoring capabilities. AWS has got CloudWatch, Azure has got Sentinel and other log management tools within it. They allow you to get those logs and to search them and to query them and to set up rules, for want of a better word, that will alert you when stuff happens across the entire stack, right the way from the network conversations, right the way through to XYZ added 100% to this person's salary, for example.
So I think there is another challenge which you just touched on there, which is when you've got such a huge volume of logs, there can be privacy issues about the data that's actually in those logs, and therefore trying to enforce access controls can be really hard when you've got a big bucket full of logs that's going into maybe a common log repository, to make sure that only the right people can see that data, or even to think about, is it sensible to log certain data in the first place?
Yes, and unfortunately that needs a full stack logging and monitoring decision-making process.
Hard.
And it's hard and it's expensive.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to sort of stick to the sort of the subject, as it were. When it comes to cloud products, we don't get to make those decisions about what's logged. Maybe there's some buttons, but ultimately, when it comes to AWS, it's got a really good audit trail of who did what within AWS, right? And when it comes to activity of the internet to AWS services, for example, that depends on what the service is, and they've made decisions about what generates logs.
Another answer to that question basically is with the banks especially, most of the big banks have got furlough processes in place so that the employee needs to be out of the bank, not not handling any of the software of the bank, not advising anybody, nothing whatsoever. He needs to be like every 3 months, I think they take a week off and they have a furlough process so that these kind of dishonest activities can be monitored.
Absolutely. And compliance leave.
Actually, we have a whole department doing this thing, but simply the amount of data coming in, it is not practically possible for them to go through it.
Oh, no, it's not. And so I spent a lot of time working on logging and monitoring solutions for huge banks. And the problem was always like, okay, I've got 2 people whose job it is 24/7 to be responding to alerts. So the question is, within an 8-hour shift, what are the 50, because that's approximately the most things that people can do in an 8-hour shift, is about 50. And what are the 50 most valuable things that somebody could be doing in that day? And that's hard and requires continuous reevaluation because, for example, does anybody get Office 365 alerts about impossible travel? Yeah, that's it, right. So that kind of use case for monitoring used to be really hard because you'd have to build a monitoring system that would look at the locations of people logging in. Now Microsoft does that. So if somebody generally speaking, Microsoft does that. So the time that perhaps those 2 people whose job it was 24/7 to be looking at alerts, okay, do they now need to be doing that? Can that be done by someone like manager? Can they spend that 100 things per 8 hour that between the 2 of them doing something else that's more valuable? And that certainly wasn't in my slides.
There are lots of false positives. I just got one now because
Yep.
the Wi-Fi IP address location is in Swindon.
Yep.
Office 365 said, hey, hang on, 20 minutes ago you were in London. How come you're in Swindon? That's impossible travel.
That's the least, that has to be the least glamorous impossible travel in the world. No offense to Swindon, but it's like.
So there are an awful lot of questions and comments coming in and we're getting near the end.
Okay, right, I'm gonna speed.
But what I'm saying is, I mean, if we pass these questions and comments to you.
Yes, of course. I think, well, we've had a couple of minutes. I mean, what time? Toxie, there's someone waiting to get in the room as well. Wow.
It's rather late.
Yeah, oh gosh, we're running out of time, aren't we? Right, okay, so what about everything else? So yeah, generative AI, obviously, we'll have that in a second, but we need good policy in place here, really. Access governance is generally quite good within those enterprise tools. We've got good support for things like single sign-on, generally speaking. And this wasn't the case, let's say 10 years ago, right? So we've really moved on. And also with, for example, APIs for giving us information about who's got access to what within that SaaS product, we can support the joiners, movers and leavers process to make sure that everybody within that SaaS environment is somebody who genuinely should be there and they haven't left 6 months ago. Not that ever happens, of course, right? So. Okay, right. So I think I've just denied someone entry.
Well, by the way.
So no offense to whoever that was. Right. Okay. So some strategies, none of which are new. Sorry. So what we need to do is we need a good set of controls. We need an information security management system, basically. And from my experience, that works best when you align that with a set of standards. So NIST, ISO, if we're in the UK, Cyber Essentials, PCI, standards framework. And that's got to be coupled with effective policy and procedures aligned to that strategy. What do I mean by effective? Well, everybody's got to know their responsibility, especially when it comes to new technology or new services, let's say ChatGPT. We've got to have a checkpoint. Someone needs to raise a ticket or ask a question before they use a new service at the very least, and somebody needs to look at it and figure out if that's something that we want people to be using. What happens when someone leaves? We need a good process to make sure that if somebody leaves, that any non-single sign-on integrated tools, that the access is removed, that kind of stuff. So good policy, good process, good procedure. And then finally, from a kind of from a technical perspective, good asset governance. We need to know what we're controlling. slide with the lots of computers without the right agents on them. Identity and access is really critical. And somebody once said to me that identity and access is the only control in the cloud. I'm not quite sure I believe that, but it's a good assertion. And finally, make the most of your existing investments. If you have a cloud environment, you can very cheaply, in a kind of within the context of a large business or medium-sized business, you can add lots of services to give the security best practice that you need. So just to summarize, and I've tried to kind of tie this back to the original title, with more things in more places than ever before to protect, how can the security professional keep up? Well, and I'm just going to kind of, unfortunately, this kind of repeats the previous slide a little bit, but have good policies outlining roles and responsibilities so that you can know what you're protecting, both through technology, you can see from APIs, etc., what's out there, and also you can get details of things that you can't see through IT, through the process and procedure. Make sure all that your defenses are in place, because you can spend lots of money rolling out a very exciting new technology, but then forget to roll it out onto a server that's compromised, and then kind of the ROI perhaps is brought into question, the return on investment. And then finally, regularly review and assess, especially around your policies. As I said before, everyone needs to know that they can't just use ChatGPT without asking somebody the right sort of questions. And that brings that to an end.
But before we get any more questions from the floor, there's one question that was asked by Simon M. There's a lot of questions on here, but the
That's
one
good. Go for
asked
it.
by Simon M. Where do you see the job requirements developing towards to perform these job task areas now and in the future? So obviously looking to what you think is needed to make this. Is it going to create more work? Is it going to create more jobs? Is it?
Well, I can't see this
machine
reduce.
learning
So
doing it?
well, I think it's so I don't think AI is going to replace everybody, right? But I think it's going to change what people do. How exactly that? I'm not an expert on this. I'm sure many people discuss it over the next few years. I know things are going to change. Exactly what they will be, I don't know. All I can say is that a long time ago, people were really worried about the effect of automated telephone exchanges on people that were employed to run switchboards. And we find it moved on. So.
Yeah, indeed. Yes, I remember the first job I ever was offered was as a telecommunications something or other for the post office, as it was then, so long ago, before BT. Anyway, I didn't take the job. I've got one sort of question. You said in there at the end about knowing what it was you were protecting, and
Yes.
And you did mention earlier about asset management, and my experience is, I don't know what the rest of you feel, but I don't know what you feel, is that is often a very poor defined part of any organization, and it makes security very difficult to achieve.
Well, absolutely. And in terms of like what we do as a business, it's not very sexy, but actually that's what we spend a lot of time doing, is helping support that asset management process. Because quite frankly, if you were very, very new to this world, you go, oh, everything's just well documented. It's all fine. But in reality, things change quickly, as I tried to sort of highlight on one of the slides there. And it's just not realistic to expect everyone to have 100% asset management. So what you've got to do really well is use the data that you have to fill in those knowledge gaps and to make sure that everything is protected as well as you can.
Anything more from the floor? Well, in that case, I'd just like to thank Chris very much for what was a very stimulating and I hope you all enjoyed it.
Yeah.